Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in a minute. I'll share the screen with the content. Okay, good afternoon. I see you've still got a minute, so we'll wait. We'll see if anybody else is going to join us. Some of the regulars not here yet. Okay, I think we'll get started. And those who are, David's just arrived, so welcome, David. We're going to get started, and the others, regulars, are not here yet. Hopefully we'll see them shortly.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hi there. Okay, can you see the screen? Can you see the shared screen? Okay, great. Yes. We're going to get started. Okay, just muted everyone just so we don't get the feedback. And if at any point you do want to comment or question, you can unmute yourself. So we begin the next section of law. We've just had a couple of weeks of learning the laws of Meiser. And we'll see. I see Ellen is asking a question already. You'll see by the end of today. Okay, you'll see how it works. Of course, much of these laws are relevant in its most practical way only during temple times as well. But as to whether or not the law of Ma'aser Sheni applies outside the land of Israel, particularly in South Africa, we'll see that's actually part of today's chapter. Okay, let's begin though with the introduction. As we said, we've been learning the laws of tithing. That's the truma we've done, and the tithe, that's the main tithe. And in addition to that, as we've mentioned in passing, there was also any given year a second tithe. We have a tithe that's called the second tithe, and we have a tithe that's called Ma'aser Ani, which is dealt with separately. So here we're going to learn about the laws of the second tithe, and we'll see that combined together with the second tithe, the Rambam has joined another interesting agricultural law, which is what we refer to as neta rivai, which is the growth of the fourth year. Basically, when a person plants a new tree, for the first 3 years, the produce is prohibited. One is not allowed to eat from it. In the fourth year, there are special laws that pertain to that, the product of those trees, those fruit, which are very similar to the produce of the second tithe. And that's why the Rambam brings these two laws together. In a moment, we'll read through what the primary mitzvahs are, the specific divine instructions are around these two practices. And then we'll get into today's chapter, which primarily deals with how to define a year and concurrently how to define the status of the fruit for the purpose of determining which second tithe must be taken. Because basically, we have what's called the Ma'aser Sheni, so there's always a second tithe taken. But in the Shemitah cycle, in the 7-year cycle, in the 3rd and the 6th year, the second tithe that was taken is not Ma'aser Sheni, but is Ma'aser Ani, which means a tithe for the poor. So it's very important that we know what year to consider a given harvest. Okay? Because then you take the correct tithe. If it's year 2, then you would be taking Ma'aser Sheni. If it's the product of year 3, if the harvest is considered product of year 3, then you'd have to be taking Ma'aser Ani. You'd have to be giving it to the poor. Okay, so that's why it's important to know, and that's primarily what we're going to discuss in today's chapter. Let's begin with the introduction, which gives us the mitzvahs that we are coming to expound on. So he says, the laws of Ma'aser Sheni contain 9 mitzvot, 3 positive commandments and 6 negative, and they are as follows. To separate the second tithe, that's the first positive mitzvah. The first negative mitzvah is not to use the proceeds from its redemption for any other human needs aside from eating, drinking, or anointing oneself. We'll learn that the second tithe although it was a separated amount of fruit or grain, depending on the harvest, becomes obligatory to take that food up to Jerusalem where it would be eaten under certain conditions. Now, one could not always easily transport that grain or fruit to Jerusalem. So what you could do is you could sell that. And then you would take the money to Jerusalem and spend the money in Jerusalem. So the prohibition is like this: you may not use it for anything aside from eating, drinking, or in certain occasions, anointing oneself, that money. Number 3, not to partake of the second tithe in a state of ritual impurity. You had to be tahor when eating it. Not to partake of the second tithe while in mourning. Not to partake of the second tithe of grain while outside of Jerusalem. As mentioned, you had to take it to Jerusalem. Not to partake of the second tithe of wine while outside Jerusalem. As we'll see, this tithe was taken from all different types of product. And the third in this kind of connected prohibitions is not to partake of the second tithe of olive oil while outside of Jerusalem. And here we come to the second associated mitzvah: for the entire crop of the 4th year to be consecrated. The requirement is that it must be eaten in Jerusalem by its owners according to all the particulars that apply to the second tithe. So that's why we've grouped these two mitzvot together, because you're going to treat that produce, that crop, the same way you treat Maaser Sheni. And the final mitzvah is to make the declaration associated with the giving of the tithes, as we'll learn. Once one is, we know we've spoken about Truma, we've spoken about Maaser, and so on. Once one is separated all that he's obligated, there was a special prayer declaration that one made. And that's a positive mitzvah to make sure one expresses that after having tithe. Okay, so that's what we're going to explain in the ensuing chapters. And I mentioned primarily in chapter 1, we're going to talk about really defining the year and when in the stages, as we'll see, of the development of a particular grain, fruit, or vegetable, is it considered to have been part of 1 year or the next year? Okay, as an opening, he says, after separating the first tithe, every year we separate the second tithe. As the verse says, aser ta'aser es kol tfuasarecha. You shall certainly tithe the produce of your crops. In the Hebrew, you can see it a bit more clearly. It says aser ta'aser, which we translate as you shall certainly tithe, but it's the double expression, you shall tithe, implies that there's a second tithe every year. In the 3rd and 6th year of a 7-year agricultural cycle, we separate the tithe for the poor instead of the second tithe, okay, which refers to the second tithe, as we explained. So, when is the year determined for the purpose of tithing? The 1st of Tishrei is the beginning of the year with regard to the reckoning of the tithes for grain, legumes, and vegetables. Whenever the term Rosh Hashanah is used with regard to crops, the intent is the 1st of Tishrei. Okay, so grains, legumes, and vegetables, anything, we'll see the date is Rosh Hashanah. What has to happen to that grain, those legumes or vegetables before Rosh Hashanah will be another point, but Rosh Hashanah is the determining date. When we say Rosh Hashanah, we're talking about the 1st of Tishrei, what we commonly refer to as Rosh Hashanah. But we know there are also other days in the Jewish calendar that are referred to as Rosh Hashanah, particularly for the purposes of this discussion. The 15th of Shvat, right, is called the Rosh Hashanah of the trees. Why is it called the Rosh Hashanah of the trees? Well, one of the reasons is this, because the 15th of Shvat is the beginning of the year with regard to reckoning of the tithes for fruit trees. Okay? So what's implied? If grains or legumes reach the phase of tithing before Rosh Hashanah of the 3rd year, okay? So, and as far as what exactly determines the phase of tithing, we will further elaborate, but based on what we've learned previously, for the most part, what we're referring to is once one of these products have grown at least a 1/3 of its growth, okay? Once it's grown a 1/3 of its growth, it's ready to be tithed, basically, even if you're not yet harvesting it. So he says, if the grain or legume reached the phase of tithing before Rosh Hashanah of the 3rd year, right? The Rosh Hashanah is going to now introduce the 3rd year. So he said the second tithe should be separated from them, even though they become fully developed and were gathered in the 3rd year. So although I'm only going to harvest it a few weeks after Rosh Hashanah, And although it further ripens after Rosh Hashanah, so long as it's reached a third of its growth, which means at that point, theoretically, I can take it and use it. It's now obligated in its Meiser at Rosh Hashanah. Because it's obligated in its Meiser at Rosh Hashanah, so what happens is that I take the second tithe from that produce, even though I'm only gathering it a number of weeks later. However, if they did not reach the phase of tithing until after Rosh Hashanah of the third year, so the tithe for the poor should be separated from them. In other words, now they are considered the product of year 3. You following? Grain and legumes, Rosh Hashanah. So we know when the date on the calendar is to determine one year from the other. But now we're talking about what has to happen before that date or after that date. So when it comes to grain and legumes, it must have reached at least a third of its growth, and then it's considered to be part of year 2, even if I'm only harvesting in year 3. If it has not reached that stage, in other words, it's grown less than a third and continues growing into year 3, then it's considered the product of year 3. And because it's the product of year 3, the tithe that you separate is the tithe for the poor. Okay, similarly, if fruit from trees reach the phase of tithing before the 15th of Shvat in the third year, it should be tithed according to the previous year, and the second tithe should be separated from it, even though it became fully developed and was gathered at the end of the third year. Another, the same idea as with vegetables, as with legumes and grains. When we talk about, talk about the first of Tishrei being Rosh Hashanah, that which develops before that, even if it's only going to be harvested after, belongs to the previous year. That which only reaches a third of its growth after Rosh Hashanah belongs to the third year. When it comes to trees, the cutoff date is the 15th of Shvat. So if the fruit on the tree had ripened at least a third, it belongs to the second year. If it hadn't, then it belongs to the third year. And again, if it belongs to the second year, you tithe the second tithe. If it belongs to the third year, the tithe that you give is the tithe to the poor. Okay, so similarly, if it reaches the phase of tithing before the 15th of Shvat in the fourth year, the tithe for the poor should be separated from it, even though it became fully developed and was gathered at the end of the fourth year. So he's just pushing it out a year, but if it was completed its growth before the fourth year, that means it's considered product of the third year, and you take the tithe for the poor, even if you're only going to be gathering it in during the fourth year. If it reaches the phase of tithing after the 15th of Shvat, then it should be tithe like the produce of the coming year. The coming year doesn't mean I'm waiting another full year. It means the year that I'm currently in. Okay, halacha 3. Even though the fruit of, so this is interesting. This is a unique type of food, which is some people eat, but generally it is grown for animal feed, and therefore there's a doubt. Those type of foods which are not primarily grown for human consumption, the obligation to tithe them is only a rabbinic obligation, as opposed to regular grain fruit and so on, which is a biblical obligation. So he says like this: even though the fruit of carob trees begin to ripen before the 15th of Shvat, meaning they've grown more than a third, they should be tithed according to the coming year, since the obligation to tithe them is of a rabbinic nature. In other words, unlike other fruit that you will tithe them according to when their major development took place, you would treat it similar to, as we'll soon see, like vegetables, that is tithed according to the year that it was gathered in. Okay, and then Rambam goes and says, it appears to me that this applies only with regard to carobs that grow in salmona or other similar species that are not fit to be eaten by most people. Right, this is the point I mentioned in the introduction. The reason for this unique halacha is because we're talking about something that usually is not grown nor fit for human consumption. Hence, the obligation to partake of them is a rabbinic in origin. It appears to me that other carobs are similar to the rest of the fruit trees, and others carobs that are grown for human consumption, that you would treat like another regular fruit tree, and you would tithe it according to the year that the majority of its development took place, that it grew at least a third of its development. So we dealt with grains, legumes, and we've dealt with fruit. And now we turn to vegetables. So although grains, legumes, and vegetables, the New Year is considered Rosh Hashanah, the first of Tishrei, but what has to happen before Rosh Hashanah or after Rosh Hashanah will be different for vegetables. Okay? Vegetables should be tithed according to the year when they are harvested. what's implied? If they are harvested on the day of Rosh Hashanah of the third year, meaning already from the first day of Rosh Hashanah, of course, technically you can't harvest on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, it's Yom Tov. But maybe a non-Jew did it on your behalf, which also you wouldn't do initially, but it was your product. So already from the first day of Rosh Hashanah, it's considered the third year. The tithe because it's the third year, tithe for the poor should be separated from them, even though they reached the phase of tithing and indeed fully matured in the second year, right? Although this is what he's saying. Even if it was fully ripe before Rosh Hashanah, when it comes to vegetables, you only tithe them according to when they are harvested. If they were harvested in the fourth year, the second tithe should be separated from them, as is required of the fourth year. Again, emphasizing that we go after the moment that it's harvested. We don't look at when it reached what we called the phase of tithing, or a third of its growth. So that makes it distinct from grain, legumes, and from fruit of the tree. Now, interesting, there is one exception with regard to fruit. Similarly, amongst fruit from the tree, only an esrog is like a vegetable. And the reason is because esrog is unique in the type of irrigation that it requires. It requires constant irrigation. Being that it requires constant irrigation, so you only tithe it when you actually harvest it. And it's for that same reason by the vegetables. It doesn't have a perpetual growth. It grows. What you take out is what you eat. So you tithe from when you take it out. So the same thing is with an esrog. Whether for tithes or the sabbatical year are dependent on when it is harvested. In other words, if it's ready for harvest in the seventh year, then it's the sabbatical year, not after or before. So what's implied? Okay, so he speaks it out. If it was harvested in the third year after the 15th of Shvat, okay, the tithe for the poor should be separated from it, even though its growth was completed in the second year, right? Usually by a fruit tree, you would take the second tithe because its growth was completed in the second year. But yeah, because you're only harvesting it in the third year, you would take the Meiser Oni. Similarly, if it was gathered in the fourth year before the 15th of Shvat, the tithe for the poor should be separated from it because it's still the third year. If it was harvested in the fourth year after the 15th of Shvat, then the second tithe should be separated from it. Following again, simply when it is harvested, not when it reaches a third of its growth. Halacha 6. Although the laws governing an esrog depend on when it was reaped, when an esrog that grew in the sixth year enters into the seventh year, so this is going to be a unique halacha. Okay, so it's now grown into the sixth year, and now it stays on the tree into the seventh year. Now, usually, here's the thing, usually produce that grows in the seventh year, because the seventh year is the Shemitah year, and everything that grows during that year is considered hefker, ownerless, because anybody can come into my property and help themselves to that food. Something that is ownerless is not obligated in tithes. Okay, but he's saying the esrog is unique. Although usually we say the esrog you determine when you take its meiser when you harvest it, right? Which means you shouldn't have to tithe it at all until you harvest it. But he says when it comes to the sixth year, if it's reached the majority of its growth in the sixth year, and now it goes into the seventh year. So although most product that is harvested in the seventh year or fully developed in the seventh year is free from the obligation of tithes, with the esrog, you've got to balance both these things. You got to, on the one hand, it's considered to have the holiness of the sabbatical year, and it's not yours per se, anybody can have it, but you are required to separate tithes from it. He says this applies even though it was only an olive size at the beginning of the sabbatical year and became the size of a loaf of bread during that year. In other words, even if it only grew a little bit in the sixth year, it's already obligated in tithes, and it also now has the stringencies of the sabbatical year. Halacha 7, we apply both the stringencies that apply to trees and those that apply to vegetables to caper berries. Okay, I'm not sure exactly what a caper berry is, but its growth pattern seems to be that it doesn't have like perpetual growth. It regrows every year, similar to a vegetable. On the other hand, it's like, I guess it grows in a type of bush, which is similar to a tree. So he says, so what happens? Now you've got to apply both stringencies. And this is what's going to be interesting. He says, so thus, if they grew from the second year, and then they entered into the third year, and were harvested before the 15th of Shvat, so the first tithe should be separated. See, what happens to a vegetable? A vegetable, right? You're now in the third year. You are harvesting it, and it should therefore you should be taking off Meiser Oni. But for a tree, you haven't yet passed the 15th of Shvat, so it's only the second year, and you should be taking off Meiser Sheni. So this one means that you want to satisfy both obligations. How do you do it? So he says, once you've harvested it, take off your first tithe. Okay. Afterwards, separate another tithe, and then so you separate some of those fruit. And what do? It should be redeemed and then given to the poor. So what you do is you separate a second tithe. As we said earlier, the product that you're going to separate from the second tithe, which you need to take up with you to Jerusalem, you can redeem that by selling it. And you can take the money up to Jerusalem and then spend that money in Jerusalem in an appropriate fashion. So this is what the Rambam is saying you got to do. You got to separate the second tithe, but redeem it. Sell those berries. Now you have money. That money is now your Meiser Sheni, which you're going to take up to Jerusalem. Now, usually what would happen to those berries is you can just throw it back into your own personal use. He says in this instance, what you have to do is you have to take those berries, which were technically redeemed, and give those to the poor. And that way, what you've done is, so he says the proceeds of redemption should be used to purchase food that is eaten according to the laws of the second tithe. Thus, it is as if you separate both the second tithe and the tithe for the poor. You've done both. Okay. Other produce that has it's kind of unique is in Halacha 8. He says with regard to rice, millet, poppy seeds, and sesame seeds, even if your plants took root before Rosh Hashanah. So this is another consideration. You see, this is different to other things that we want to see the majority of its growth, because these are products that you actually eat the kind of the seed itself. It's the whole product is the grain that grows. So he's saying, and in those products, when it takes root, is considered significant. Now, we don't necessarily have to wait for a third of its growth. We just wait for it to take root. But so Rambam is saying for the purpose of Meiser as follows: even if the plants took root before Rosh Hashanah, we are concerned only with the completion of the maturity of the fruit, and thus the tithes are separated as is the product of the coming year. In other words, when you actually are going to gather it in, once it's fully matured. Similarly, with regard to Egyptian beans, we'll see in a moment that Egyptian beans are actually a unique product. In Halacha 10, it's a bit of a complex halacha. We'll try halt kop, as they say, keep our heads straight to understand it fully. But the Egyptian bean is an unusual product which they would sometimes grow for the seed and sometimes for the so-called vegetable. It seems that it's a leafy product around a bean or a seed. So he says, similarly with regard to the Egyptian beans, even though a portion of the crop took root before Rosh Hashanah and a portion afterwards, he should gather the entire crop together and separate Truma and the Meiser from the entire crop as one, for everything depends on the produce reaching maturity. And we'll see that there's going to be unique situations with this Egyptian bean, because sometimes people plant it only for the seed and not for this vegetable part of it, and sometimes the other way around. And depending on what your intention is, and when you harvest it, it will affect what type of meiser you have to take. Halacha 9 is a unique halacha with regard to certain onions. It seems there are three types of onions. There are onions that continue to sprout after you've harvested them because they maintain some type of moisture. And the onions that do not continue to sprout after you've harvested them because they lose their moisture. So, but either way, we got a unique halacha as follows. He says, when one withheld water from onions that do not produce sprouts for 30 days, this is before Rosh Hashanah, right? Or when one withheld water from onions that are irrigated from 3 periods before Rosh Hashanah, they should be tithed as produce of the previous year. Right? We said earlier that vegetables and the onion is vegetable, you would only tithe it from when you harvest it. Okay? But this is a unique scenario where the onion, you haven't harvested it yet, but it was already, it's very clear that its growth is fully completed, and therefore you would take meiser from it then. How do I know that its growth is fully completed? So he says, in the case of onions that don't sprout, you would have withheld water from it for 30 days. And if it's onions, for onions that do not sprout for 30 days, or if you held 3 periods of watering. Now, 3 periods of watering we could change from farm to farm or onion to onion. Let's say somebody waters 3 times a week. So if before Rosh Hashanah, he withheld 3 weeks of watering, then it shows that this product is now complete and it's ready to be tithed, and you would tithe it on the previous year. Okay, so if it was the second year, it would be Meiser Sheni. If it was the third year going into the fourth year, you would separate Meiser Ani. Now, if water was held from them for less than this, and thus they began to dry up before Rosh Hashanah, they should be tithed like produce of the coming year. So even though it's complete, but you didn't withhold for a long enough period, it's considered the coming year or the year that you actually harvested. Okay, the following rules apply when Egyptian beans reached a third of their growth before Rosh Hashanah. And this, I'm going to read this, and we're just going to try to keep our heads, hold the heads on straight here because it's a bit complicated. But he says like this. He says, so now they've reached a third of their growth before Rosh Hashanah. What do you do with them? Okay, in other words, basically we want to know, are they considered like legumes or are they considered like vegetables? That's kind of the dilemma over here. Okay, so he says if they were sown to produce seed, that means they are considered like legumes. They should be tithed as product of the previous year. If they were sown to produce vegetables, they're like vegetables, and they should be tithed as a product of the coming year. But now it gets complicated. If they were sown to produce seed and vegetables, or they were sown to produce seed, and then the owner changed his mind and thought to use them for vegetables as well, he should tithe from the seeds for the vegetables and from the vegetables as seeds. In other words, he should wait till they're all together and take one tithe. But now a different rule applies if the beans did not reach. That's all if it was reached its full, at least a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah. But once if it did not reach 1/3 of its growth before Rosh Hashanah. So if they were sown to produce seed, they should be tithed as product of the previous year. But the vegetable that grows should be tithed as they are harvested, provided they are harvested before Rosh Hashanah. Okay, which is interesting because they're not yet fully grown, but the fact that you're harvesting it indicates that they're ready enough for you, even if they haven't reached a third of their growth. But because you're harvesting it, you're showing that it's ready for you, and therefore you would have to tithe it like the vegetables. If they were harvested after Rosh Hashanah, both the vegetables and the seeds should be tithed as produce of the coming year, because it, as far as the legume is concerned, it hadn't reached a third of its growth yet. And if they were sown to produce seed, now this is another interesting situation. Initially, he thought he's growing it for seed. Then he changed his mind. He thought he's going to use it for vegetables only. And this is where he decides he's going to use it only for vegetable. Then the ruling follows his thought. In other words, you treat it like a vegetable. If they were sown to produce vegetables, what is if he initially planted them because he thought he wanted the vegetable, the leafy part of it, and then he changed his mind and thought to use them for seed? The thought to use it as a seed has no effect on the ruling unless he withholds water from it for 3 periods. In other words, because the vegetable is what's primary, so if he first planted a seed and changed to vegetable, that becomes the definition of that for him, and he would only tithe it according to the harvest, as you would for a vegetable. But if he initially planted it as a vegetable and then he decides he only wants the seeds, because it's a secondary thing, his thought is not good enough. He would have to prove that he's only interested in the seed by withholding water for 3 periods before Rosh Hashanah. And as if he doesn't water it for 3 times when he would usually water it, and then only when the plants reach a third of their growth before Rosh Hashanah. And then he would tithe it according to, like the seeds, the second year, the previous year, not the next year. Now I have it governed by different rules if they did not reach a third of their growth before Rosh Hashanah, even though he withheld water from it for 3 periods when the plants would be ordinarily watered. So what happens if he intended to plant it for vegetable, then decide he wants it only for seeds? He withholds water to show that his intention is real. If it grows 1/3 before Rosh Hashanah, then he treats it as seeds and would tithe it as the previous year. But what if it didn't grow 1/3? Okay, before Rosh Hashanah. So he said, if he sowed it for the purpose of seed and the entire crop grew into fully grown plants in Rosh Hashanah, the seed is tithed as produce of the previous year. And the vegetables are tithed according to when they are harvested. Then he has to separate it. Take a tithe from the seeds for the previous year and a tithe from the vegetable, the leafy part, for the year that it's harvested. If some of the plants reach their full growth and some did not, so this is interesting, right? So, and you don't know which one, obviously, now they're all mixed together. To this situation, we apply our statement he should gather the entire crop together. Thus, he should separate tithes from the entire crop as one, separating tithes from the seeds for the vegetables and from the vegetables as seeds, meaning one tithe, all combined together, like the first scenario where he planted it and it didn't fully develop before Rosh Hashanah. Then when you harvest it, you just take the tithe, you take it all as one tithe of that year that you're harvesting it. Okay, halacha 11, when produce from the second year becomes mixed with produce from the third year, or produce from the third year becomes mixed with that of the fourth year. So now you got a doubt, right? Because each one requires a different tithe. So what do? So he says, if it's half and half, we separate the second tithe from the entire quantity, but not the tithe for the poor. In other words, what he's saying is you give precedence to the second tithe over the tithe for the poor. The rationale is that the second tithe is more severe obligation because it is sacred, while the tithe for the poor is ordinary produce. Okay, so I just think I actually explain this halakha because it sounds like what it's saying is that you had a whole bunch of fruit that mixed together. You knew some of it was from the second year and you knew some of it was from the third year, and they came together. That's not the scenario. The scenario is when you have one bucket that you know for sure is the second year, you have one bucket that you know for sure is the third year, and then you find a pile that is separated from both of them and you don't know which one it came from. Okay, not that they both mixed together. You don't know which one that came from. He says then you've got to tithe it according to whichever bucket is bigger, because we assume that it came from the larger pile. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. We assume that it comes from the larger pile. If it's half and half, meaning both were the same size, so we don't know which one is the larger pile, you then have to prioritize. Do you give the second tithe or do you give the tithe of the poor? So he says in this situation you prioritize the second tithe because it is sacred. Remember, you're going to take it up to Jerusalem. You can't eat it in a state of impurity, and these are indications that it's a more severe obligation, and that's why it takes precedence. Similarly, when there's a doubt whether the produce is from the second year or from the third year, the second tithe should be separated from it. This is a different scenario, but it's also a scenario of doubt. But it's, for example, if you don't know, let's say it was fruit of the tree. You don't know if it reached a third of its growth before Tu B'Shvat or not. If it had, it would be for the second year. If it hadn't, it would be for the third year. So it's your doubt. You don't know. You prioritize the second tithe, even though you're harvesting it in the third year. Now, halacha 12, we're getting close to the end of the chapter. Whenever produce is exempt from the first tithe, it is also exempt from the second tithe and the tithe for the poor. So, for example, you'll remember we learned this in detail in the laws of tithes, but produce like the lekker, chicha, and peah, I guess the product of the seventh year would be similar. It's exempt from the first tithe. It's also exempt from the second tithe and the tithe for the poor. Whenever produce is obligated in the first tithe, it's also obligated in these two tithes. And similarly, all the individuals who may separate truma may also separate these tithes. And those who are not entitled to separate truma may not separate these tithes, right? So the extreme example would be someone who's not mentally sound. Whenever the individuals with regard to whom it is said that they should not separate truma, but if they separate truma, the separation is effective. An example of that to remember is someone who's drunk, because they shouldn't be doing because technically they can't make the bracha. But if they did it, it would be considered okay. So that scenario would be the same with the second tithe or the tithe of the poor, as their separation is effective. When any of the individuals with regard to whom it is said that their separation of truma is ineffective to separate these tithes, the separation is ineffective. I guess I should say to separate these tithes. Halacha 13, when a person separated the first tithe from the produce before the obligation to tithe was established. Remember, we spoke about when exactly the obligation applies, what we call the Gemar Melacha. So if a person separated from tithes before the obligation to tithe was established, he may snack from it before separating the second tithe. Right, the whole remaining pile is not considered tevel. For separating the first tithe does not create an obligation to separate the second. If, however, and because he's taken off before it's actually the obligation has been activated, he could snack from that. If an obligation to tithe was established, you finished producing it, so to speak, it's ready to go to its end product, then it is forbidden to snack from it until he separates the second tithe and the tithe for the poor, even though he's already separated the first tithe. In other words, when we talk about product being tevel, that you're not going to eat from it, you are required to separate all the necessary tithes, the first, second, and third. or second, and the alternative, which is the third, being the Meiser Ani, right? And of course, the Truma, which precedes both of those. The halacha 14, final halacha for today, since the second tithe must be brought to Jerusalem, and this answers the question that was asked right at the beginning of the class, since the second tithe needed to be brought to Jerusalem, and remember, because it's brought to Jerusalem, the produce has to be considered ritually pure, as does the person eating it. It should not be brought from the diaspora, and the reason is because it is essentially considered not tahara, impure. And it's similar to like the firstborn of animals, right? One had to separate the firstborn animal and bring it as an offering in the temple. But those from outside the land of Israel, you would not do that. Similarly, the second tithe was not brought from outside the land of Israel to Israel, to Jerusalem, for this reason. And because you can't bring it up to Jerusalem to eat it there, our sages did not obligate the separation of the second tithe in Syria, which also means really the entire diaspora. Now, we'll see there was an exception to a number of places where there were large Jewish communities in the Middle East at that time. It appears to me, the Rambam says, that the second tithe that is separated in Babylonia and in Egypt, those are two large communities in that region of Jews, and there they did continue to separate a second tithe. And we'll see in a moment why they did, but he's saying we still have the rule that you're not allowed to take that fruit up to Jerusalem because it doesn't have the ritual purity that's necessary. So what should you do with it? Should redeem it, that should be redeemed and the proceeds taken up to Jerusalem. That anyway is an option even in the land of Israel, right? So that's what would be done. Similarly, it appears to me that the obligation to separate the second tithe in these places was established not because fundamentally obligated, because that was the beginning of the halacha, that you're not obligated. Why was it established in those communities? Only so that there would be an obligation to separate the tithes for the poor, so that the poor of the Jewish people could rely on it. Basically, they wanted to make sure that in those communities, people were separating tithes for the poor in this third, sixth, and sometimes seventh year as well. And they felt that if they would, the only way to keep that momentum, that a person would get used to separating their tithes and keep it up, which would ultimately ensure that in the years where necessary, the poor would get what was due to them, they kept the second tithe going in those communities as well. Okay. We'll end that. Do the 4 questions quiz. Okay, that's a suggestion. Who would like to take up the challenge? Let's go to the bottom of the page. Hold on, I'll put it back up. Okay, hold on. So let's go to the bottom of the page. Let's see what Rabbi Weinberg has to ask of us. Okay, if grain reached 1/3 of its growth, grain, okay? Remember, at the end of the second year, and only grew to its full size during the third year, what tithe should be taken from it?
I think the tithe for the poor. No, Maser Sheni.
Second tithe, right? Because it's considered the product of the second year. Oh, yeah. Correct. Well done. Second question. If vegetables were fully grown in the second year, but they were harvested in the third year, what tithe should be taken from them? Remember, in the second year, it's Ma'aser Sheni. In the third year, it's tithe for the poor. They were fully grown in the second year, but they were only harvested in the third year. Which separation do we take?
Tithes for the poor.
Correct. Okay, right. Because we go after the harvest when it comes to vegetables. And the third question, what should be done with produce which there arose a doubt whether it is from the second or third year? Okay, that's what we just learned. You don't know. You don't know if it's second or third year. You don't know if you're required to take Ma'aser Sheni or Ma'aser Ani. Which one takes precedent? I don't know if anyone's answering on the chat. I must check. Let's see. Is anybody?
I think number 1. I think.
Okay. The correct answer is only Ma'aser Sheni, right? We said the second tithe, because it's more stringent, takes precedent. And number 4, is there any obligation to separate Ma'aser Sheni from produce grown in the diaspora? It's a little bit because we did read of exceptions, but what's the basic rule?
It's a rabbinic obligation.
So the basic rule is no, okay, you don't. But in the last halacha, we learned that in certain communities, there was an exception that the rabbis applied. Okay, there we go. Yeshikach, thanks for that.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
It
Take
was
care, everyone.
fun.
Have a wonderful day further. Yeah, good.
Bye-bye.
Sort of.
Okay.
Sort
Take
of.
care.